The evening air was heavy with the scent of rain and something unspoken, a tension that seemed to cling to the edges of every sound. I had walked into the house thinking it would be ordinary, that the quiet of the night would be a relief after weeks of restless suspicion. But then I saw her. She was sitting there, the dim lamp casting half her face in shadow, and the way she looked at him, my mind refused to name the feeling at first, made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just admiration or casual interest. There was something else in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before, a spark that wasn't meant for me. She laughed at something he said, a small tilt of her head, the kind that makes hearts skip and silence feel suffocating. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting fears I had no right to, but the unease coiled tighter with every heartbeat. Every home has its rhythm, the way footsteps echo, the soft creak of chairs, the hum of distant traffic, but tonight, the ordinary became alien. Every glance they exchanged was like a secret coded in light and shadow, each one piercing through the pretense of domestic calm. I found myself watching them, unable to look away, feeling the weight of their proximity and the intimacy of the moment like it belonged to another world. It was in the way their hands brushed, just barely, yet enough to leave sparks of awareness I could not ignore. She had told me countless times that nothing was happening, that my suspicions were unfounded, but the world around me betrayed her words. The truth lingered in the tremor of her voice, the hesitant laugh, the subtle hesitation before she looked away. I realized then that denial had been my shield, and now, standing in the shadow of something undeniable, the shield had melted. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls closing in with a quiet accusation. Every object seemed to hold weight, the coffee cup she had been holding, the way it caught the light, the cushion he shifted on as if trying to make room without touching her, the faint scent of perfume, sweet and lingering, a marker of presence that should not have existed. My hands were clammy, my thoughts scrambled, and yet every nerve in my body was acutely awake. Betrayal is not loud at first. It whispers, curls around the spine, and nestles in the chest until every breath tastes like ash. That's what this moment was, a whisper that became a roar inside me, a confirmation of what I had been afraid to name. I had trusted her completely, had built my life around a certainty that now felt fragile, almost laughable in its naivety. I tried to move, to break the spell of the scene unfolding before me. But my feet were heavy, reluctant, as if the floor itself resisted the truth I had stumbled upon. My mind reeled, 1,000 questions rising with no answer. How long had this been happening? Was it recent, or had I been blind all along? Could one glance, one lingering touch, carry so much meaning that it eroded trust in an instant? And more terrifyingly, how could I reconcile the woman I knew, who had once whispered promises into my ears, with the person I now saw, capable of this silent, potent betrayal? The night stretched long, each second punctuated by subtle movements, the quiet intimacy between them burning brighter than any candle. I wanted to scream, to demand explanation, to tear the illusion apart, but I remained frozen, captivated and horrified by the unspoken truth. Her eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of something undefinable crossing her face, but she looked away before recognition could fully register. I wasn't sure if she had seen me, or if she had seen the suspicion, the dawning awareness that had started to etch itself across my features. That moment, fleeting as it was, felt eternal. It left an imprint, a wound of understanding, the realization that some truths are not shared in words but in glances, gestures, the faint trembling of a hand, the hesitation in a smile. And in that wound, I felt every fracture of my certainty, every quiet night I had taken for granted, every trust I had given freely, suddenly weighty and fragile. I understood then that life could change in an instant, not with a shout or a fight, but with a single, loaded look that stripped away the safety of ignorance. The room seemed to hold its breath along with me, the shadows curling longer, the light dimmer, as if the house itself mourned the innocence I had lost. I stepped back, heart racing, mind clawing for rationality. but there was no escaping the clarity that had struck me. Something had shifted irrevocably. She said it meant nothing, yet her eyes told a story I could not unsee. And as I walked away, pretending to busy myself with trivial tasks, I knew the first chapter of this betrayal had begun. Every sound, every whisper, every glance from that night would echo forward, shaping the choices and fears that were yet to come, threading through my thoughts like a quiet, persistent ache that demanded acknowledgement. The storm was only just beginning, and I was standing at its edge, breathless, unsure, and entirely aware that nothing could ever feel the same again. The first flicker of suspicion had become a blaze I could no longer ignore. The signs I had once dismissed as coincidences began to weave a narrative too coherent to ignore, a story whispered between shadows and half-smiles. I caught them together more often than I should have. Small moments at first, accidental touches, the way their voices softened when no one else was around, a laugh that lingered longer than it had any right to. Each encounter felt like a silent confession, a proof written not in words but in body language, in the hesitant glance that seemed to speak volumes without daring to speak at all. The house that once felt safe and familiar now carried the weight of secrets, every hallway echoing with the sound of unspoken truths. I remember the night I found the first tangible evidence, the moment when denial finally shattered. It was a photograph, innocuous at first glance, tucked inside a book I had never touched. They were sitting together on a park bench, their knees almost touching, faces turned toward each other with a warmth I could not mistake. The image was ordinary to any casual observer, but to me it was devastating. The casual intimacy, the unguarded happiness, the way their eyes met in a silent understanding. It was proof of something forbidden, something I had feared but had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge. My hands trembled, the photograph slipping slightly, and for a moment I thought I might be sick. Betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It had taken shape, tangible and unyielding, leaving my world rearranged in ways I could not yet comprehend. Every interaction afterward became a minefield of observation and calculation. I began to notice the subtlest details, the way her laughter faltered when I entered a room, the faint blush that betrayed awareness of my presence, the careful avoidance of physical proximity, and yet the moments when my back was turned revealed everything. Their secrecy was almost elegant in its execution, but elegance cannot erase the raw human truth of desire and transgression. I wrestled with rage and disbelief, my mind oscillating between confronting her and preserving the fragile illusion of normalcy that still clung to our lives. I found myself walking through memories, dissecting conversations for hidden meanings, replaying gestures that now seemed charged with forbidden intent. Each recollection was a dagger twisting in my chest, revealing how much I had missed, how much I had been blind to while the deception grew quietly, inexorably. The psychological toll was immediate and profound. Sleep became restless, punctuated by vivid images of them together, laughter echoing through my dreams, and the faint, accusing look of her eyes haunting every waking hour. I could not speak of it without feeling my own judgment crumble, without the words catching painfully in my throat. I felt isolated, trapped within a bubble of awareness that no one else could penetrate. The betrayal had become a private torment, a silent scream that demanded recognition but could not be voiced without shattering everything in the process. Every day I moved through our shared life as if through a fog, pretending to see what was not there, hiding the truth that weighed down my every glance. Yet as the secret unfolded, there was a strange, perverse intimacy in knowing. I saw the world differently, every interaction reframed by understanding, every gesture reinterpreted through the lens of forbidden connection. The allure of secrecy was undeniable. It painted their encounters with a vibrancy that made betrayal feel almost cinematic, surreal in its intensity, and I hated myself for the fascination, the need to observe, to comprehend, to witness what I could never participate in and never forgive. The lines between anger and curiosity, between heartbreak and obsession, blurred into a constant ache that defined every hour, every movement, every thought. It was impossible to continue as if nothing had changed. The house, the people within it, the very routines that had once been comforting, were now fraught with tension. I could see it in their faces, in the careful choreography of avoidance and stolen attention, in the way they seemed to inhabit a shared world just beyond my reach. The photograph, once hidden, became a talisman of knowledge, a reminder that the ordinary life I had taken for granted was an illusion. Each day I collected evidence in subtle ways, tracing patterns, piecing together interactions, learning the cadence of deception, until the secret was no longer hidden. It was alive, pulsing, undeniable. And in the quiet of the night, when the world was still and shadows deepened, I understood with a chilling clarity that the path forward was no longer about ignorance or denial. It was about facing the truth, and whatever consequences that truth would bring. The fracture had begun, and I was caught in its center, forced to watch as a world I thought I knew shifted into something darker, more intimate, and entirely beyond my control. The secret had not only been uncovered, it had taken form, claimed space in our lives, and demanded reckoning. I could no longer escape it, and in that realization, the first seeds of anger, fear, and clarity began to grow. I knew that confrontation would come, that choices would have to be made, but for now, the only certainty was that the secret was no longer theirs alone. It had become mine, a weight of knowledge that changed everything. The air between us had grown taut, stretched by unspoken truths and lingering glances, until it felt as though even breathing too loudly might shatter everything. I could no longer pretend that the world remained simple or that loyalty was absolute. Every encounter with her carried the weight of potential exposure. Every word a subtle negotiation between honesty and self-preservation. And yet, there were moments when I caught them alone, moments when the closeness was undeniable, when the stolen gestures and quiet laughter became almost unbearable to witness. The tension was not only external, it lodged inside me, coiling around my ribs, tightening with each heartbeat until desire, fear, and rage fused into a single, restless entity that refused to be ignored. I saw it most clearly one evening when I entered the room unexpectedly, the low hum of the lamp casting soft shadows across her face. They had been talking quietly, leaning in close, the kind of proximity that made the world around them vanish. My presence went unnoticed for a long, terrible moment, and I was struck by the intimacy of it, the curve of her smile, the way his hand hovered near hers, trembling with hesitancy, as though daring to close a gap that should have remained sacred. I wanted to shout, to intervene, to reclaim the life that seemed to be slipping like sand through my fingers, but I froze, trapped between shock and an odd, involuntary fascination. It was a private performance, a secret theater where betrayal played out in gestures and glances, and I was both witness and victim. Desire and morality collided in my mind with a violent intensity. There was no longer room for simplistic binaries of right and wrong. Every thought was a negotiation, every heartbeat a moral dilemma. I found myself analyzing their behavior, tracing the arcs of attraction, understanding in painful clarity the depth of what had been developing. It was seductive and infuriating all at once, a revelation that made me question not only her loyalty, but the boundaries of human longing itself. How does one contain desire once it has been acknowledged, once it has been glimpsed in the depth of someone else's eyes? And more importantly, how do you navigate the fine line between observation and obsession, between confrontation and silent endurance? The home felt alive with secrets, every corridor vibrating with the weight of unspoken connections. I could sense their awareness of my suspicions, subtle in the shift of posture, in the careful avoidance of eye contact, yet thrilling in the way they could not fully mask their closeness. It was almost cinematic, the quiet unfolding of human frailty in which rules of ethics bent, blurred, and sometimes broke entirely. And I realized that the world I had inhabited, the clear lines of loyalty and trust I had taken for granted, no longer existed. The intimate moments I had once seen as ordinary now carried dangerous energy, and I could not help but feel both rage and an impossible, reluctant empathy for the forces at work between them. In these crossing lines, I felt the full spectrum of human complexity. The moral fabric that bound our relationships seemed to fray under the intensity of unacknowledged longing. Every small touch, every near brush of hands, every conversation laden with double meaning, became a spark that threatened to ignite the fragile stability we had maintained. I was forced to confront not only her betrayal, but my own vulnerability, my capacity for jealousy, my tendency to cling to illusions even as they unraveled. There was no simplicity in this revelation, no satisfaction in uncovering the truth, only the raw, painful recognition of human weakness, the recognition that desire and consequence often occupy the same, unavoidable space. I watched them in silence more often than I wanted, learning patterns, noting gestures, understanding the rhythm of the deceit. It was exhausting yet strangely intoxicating. In those moments I felt the world tilt, moral certainty replaced by the dizzying complexity of human emotion. I understood that boundaries could be crossed in a heartbeat, that loyalty could crumble under the pressure of proximity and temptation, and that the consequences of such crossings would ripple far beyond the immediate, touching every corner of our lives. And in that understanding, the first real fear took hold, not just of betrayal itself, but of the fallout that would inevitably follow, the social and familial earthquake waiting to be unleashed. The line had been crossed, but the real devastation was still ahead. Every glance, every touch, every quiet conversation was now a thread in a tapestry I did not wish to see completed. I could no longer live in ignorance, but knowledge brought its own unbearable weight. The intimacy they shared, forbidden yet undeniable, left me caught in a liminal space, between rage and fascination, between the desire to intervene and the need to preserve some semblance of order. And as the night deepened, I knew with a chilling clarity that nothing would ever return to what it had been. The crossing of lines was no longer hypothetical. It had taken shape, and the consequences, hidden and yet palpably imminent, were poised to change everything. The moment the truth began to spread beyond the private spaces where it had lingered, life as I had known it fractured into shards. The tension that had been carefully contained, like a hidden ember, erupted with an intensity that left no corner untouched. Family dinners became exercises in restraint, every word measured, every glance weighed, and even the air itself seemed heavy with accusation. She no longer laughed freely in my presence, her smiles faltering as though they carried a secret guilt too heavy to bear. And he, the young man whose presence had once been harmless, had become a catalyst of disruption, his every movement scrutinized, every gesture magnified by the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their complicity. The fragile facade of normalcy crumbled, replaced by a charged atmosphere where silence spoke more than words ever could. The fallout was immediate and unrelenting. Whispers began to coil through the family, subtle at first, then more blatant, carrying judgment and speculation in equal measure. The once warm and familiar spaces of our home now felt like an arena, each room echoing with unspoken accusations, each corridor shadowed with doubt. Even casual acquaintances seemed to sense the tension, their glances lingering too long, their smiles brittle. Social gatherings became exercises in endurance, a relentless parade of carefully measured conversation designed to mask the undercurrent of scandal. I could feel the weight of eyes, the invisible threads of expectation and censure tugging at the edges of my consciousness. Nothing could be ignored. Nothing could remain hidden. The secret had escaped the shadows and was now alive in the world, shaping it in ways I could not control. I found myself navigating the emotional terrain with a mixture of rage, sorrow, and bewilderment. The betrayal I had observed in intimate detail now intersected with the judgments of others, each reaction adding a layer of complexity and pain. She avoided my gaze, not just because of what she had done, but because she could no longer meet the scrutiny of a family that sensed, even if imperfectly, the depth of her transgression. And he, emboldened or perhaps reckless, moved with a subtle arrogance that spoke of his awareness of the chaos he had stirred. It was a delicate dance, one that required constant vigilance. Yet I could see the lines of tension tighten, the small cracks in their composure threatening to widen into irreparable fissures. The psychological toll was relentless. Sleep came only in fragments, my mind replaying every encounter, every gesture, every secret exchanged. I became hyper-aware of nuances in conversation, subtle shifts in tone, the half-smiles and fleeting touches that once seemed innocuous. Anger and grief mingled with a strange fascination. I could not turn away even when every glance, every sound, reminded me of the devastation wrought by choices I had only just begun to understand. Trust, once a given, became a fragile commodity, and I realized that even when words were spoken, they carried the weight of history and deception. Each interaction became a test, each moment an examination of endurance, and every human connection now seemed vulnerable to the ripples of a secret that had grown too large to contain. Family dynamics shifted in ways I could never have predicted. Those who had once offered comfort now hesitated, uncertain of how to respond to a betrayal that cut so deep and so unexpectedly. Allies became cautious, their support tempered by fear of association, while old resentments and latent tensions surfaced with renewed intensity. Conversations were freighted with subtext, and even the simplest questions seemed to carry the potential for exposure or confrontation. The social ramifications were profound. Reputations, once carefully cultivated, teetered on the edge, and relationships, both intimate and casual, became sites of negotiation, of testing and probing, of subtle but undeniable realignment. And through it all, I was forced to confront my own responses. Anger, grief, and confusion battled with an undeniable need to understand, to piece together the trajectory of choices that had led to this point. I had thought betrayal would manifest in a single moment, a dramatic revelation, but it unfolded like a slow, persistent erosion, reshaping the landscape of my life, leaving everything simultaneously familiar and alien. The consequences were not just emotional, they were structural, affecting the very framework of relationships in daily life. The weight of knowledge, once private and hidden, now demanded reckoning, demanding action, and forcing me to navigate a world in which every move carried risk, and every choice would resonate far beyond its immediate impact. As the days bled into nights, it became clear that nothing could restore what had been lost. The fractures, once invisible, had widened, and the secret that had lived in shadows now defined the very space we inhabited. Confrontation loomed like a storm on the horizon, unavoidable and inevitable, yet impossible to predict in its full force. And in the quiet moments when the house settled and the echoes of judgment softened into stillness, I understood with a chilling clarity that life had shifted irrevocably, that the fallout was no longer just a consequence of betrayal. It was a new reality in which trust, loyalty, and love would have to be rebuilt from fragments too fragile to fully hold together. The aftermath of betrayal is not loud. It is a quiet, insistent ache that settles into the bones, reshaping every thought, every feeling, until the world itself seems altered. In the weeks that followed, I walked through the remnants of what had been a shared life, noticing every detail with a new, almost unbearable clarity. The house, once a haven, now felt like a gallery of broken promises, each room holding a memory that had been tainted by deception. The laughter we had shared echoed hollowly, and the warmth of familiar routines carried a weight of irony I could not escape. I realized then that truth, once revealed, changes everything. Not just what we see, but how we see it, how we move through the spaces of our own lives. Regret settled over me like a fog, soft but suffocating. I regretted not seeing the signs sooner, not trusting my instincts, not speaking the questions that burned in my mind. But more than that, I regretted the innocence I had brought into a situation that demanded vigilance, the faith I had placed in a world that proved more fragile than I had imagined. Yet in this regret, there was also understanding. Betrayal, I learned, is not only a transgression of loyalty, but a mirror held up to our own vulnerabilities, forcing us to confront fears and desires we may have long denied. The emotional clarity it brings is painful, yet necessary, a brutal teacher revealing both human weakness and the complexity of love. I spent hours reflecting on the choices that had led us here, on the intersections of desire, secrecy, and consequence that had shaped our lives. I thought of her, of the young man, of myself, and of the invisible lines we had crossed. Each reflection carried both anger and a reluctant empathy. It is easy to condemn from a distance, but when one has lived within the proximity of transgression, one understands the forces that twist loyalty, desire, and morality into something unrecognizable. I recognized in her actions not only betrayal, but also fear, longing, and the human tendency to seek connection, however misguided. And I recognized in myself the challenge of navigating these truths without being consumed by them. Social judgment, though harsh and often unfair, became a distant echo compared to the personal reckoning that consumed me. Friends and family speculated, whispered, and questioned, but their voices, though loud, did not pierce the deeper understanding I had gained. The real confrontation was internal, a constant negotiation between anger, grief, and the strange, reluctant compassion that comes from seeing the full spectrum of human desire. I realized that every decision, every fleeting gesture, carries weight beyond what is immediately visible, and that understanding those choices does not excuse them, but it illuminates the tangled, unavoidable complexity of human life. In the quietest moments, I confronted the most difficult truths about myself, the ways in which I had relied too heavily on assumptions, the comfort I had taken in perceived loyalty, the blind spots that allowed deception to flourish. These reflections were painful, yet they offered a form of freedom, the freedom that comes from seeing clearly, from understanding the depth of betrayal, and from acknowledging the consequences without denial. I began to rebuild slowly, fragment by fragment, learning to navigate relationships with caution but also with renewed awareness. Trust would not return to its former simplicity, but it could evolve, shaped by experience, hardened by clarity, and informed by the lessons of heartbreak. And as I looked back on those long nights of observation, of quiet discovery, of the subtle unraveling of everything I thought I knew, I realized that life's truth is rarely gentle. It asks for endurance, reflection, and the courage to face the parts of ourselves and others we would rather ignore. The betrayal that once consumed my nights now lingered as a memory, a lesson in both human frailty and resilience. The ache of lost innocence remained, but alongside it came a quiet strength. The understanding that even in the wake of deception, life continues, and with it, the possibility of clarity, wisdom, and a fragile, tempered hope. In the end, the secret revealed itself not just as a wound, but as a mirror reflecting the complexity of desire, the inevitability of consequence, and the enduring capacity of the human heart to learn, to mourn, and ultimately to endure.